My name's Jack Graham and I run Year here. So I plan to tell you a bit about what we do, some of the kind of big ideas that sit behind the way we've designed the programme as we have, and also to talk about some of the themes emerging from our social enterprises, particularly in relation to cities and urban development. So in a nutshell, Year Here is a postgraduate course. We work with young professionals who are ambitious about making society better, put them through a very intensive programme over 10 months, within which they are pushed to build what we think are smart solutions to social problems in all sorts of different contexts, from very frontline organisations like homeless hostels and community centres, through to consulting engagements with SMEs, local government, and on to building their own social ventures, 3 of which you'll be hearing from later. But as I said, I'd like to start with some of the kind of the ideas or the kind of principles that sit behind what we do. So first up, I know that I'm definitely preaching to the choir in a place like Future Cities Catapult, but this idea that inequality demands innovation. So we are clearly surrounded by a whole bunch of intractable social problems which are pretty grave and which cause lots of people to be thinking about them and trying to tackle them, but ultimately failing. And when you look at some of our kind of traditional vehicles for social change, be it politics, be it getting out on the streets and protesting, be it kind of philanthropy, all of those approaches seem somewhat kind of insufficient or kind of maladapted to the current state of affairs. Whereas if you look at data, technology, social business, some of these different angles on social problems, that's where it can kind of get exciting again. There's a sense of possibility. So that's very much where we sit. The second idea that we think about is this idea that every generation has an opportunity to reimagine the society in which it's born. And every year, thousands of people are churned out of university in Britain who are passionate about fairness and justice and equality. And it's kind of on us as a society to design a structure to catch that amazing energy and channel it in a really positive way. So people like Obama, who, as many of you guys will know, was a community organizer straight out of university in Chicago. William Beveridge, who spent 2 years at Toynbee Hall, before going on to be one of the architects of the welfare state. Octavia Hill, one of the founders of the National Trust and the kind of housing association movement. All these people did a lot of their work in their 20s, and so we're interested in what you can do to capture that spirit and idealism that so many people have before it gets lost. Third big idea is that solving social problems starts with understanding them. And for this one, I want to show a quick video. So hopefully this is going to work.
I don't want to leave the world and be nothing.
Shutting myself away, just getting more and more depressed.
There should not be a long-term plan for our hostels. It should be short-term, back into the real world.
The depression started due to losing a couple of close relatives. Part of that time I was homeless. I was in a hostel in Hackney. That's where gardening plays an important part. I used to be a bit wary of young people, but meeting someone like Miranda changed my mind a bit. She never forgot about me.
I come from a single parent background. My neighbourhood's very diverse. It's not the richest area. I went to study law and become a barrister. I've got a lot on my plate right now. Dami is a nice person, so he understands what it is that we need and how to help.
I was in a bad situation that landed me homeless. When you've got less and less housing available every year or every month or even every week, you're kind of left in limbo. That's why some people have been here 3 years, some people have been here 7 years. The year here people have a hands-on approach. They see you as a human being. They treat and talk to you with respect.
And we got married. It was 1960. We had a happy 56 years. She's got difficulty with breathing, and I'm struggling to cope. I've got to do the shopping, the cleaning, the cooking. And if you've ever eaten a dinner cooked by a plumber, you'd know what I'm talking about. Yes, Snay introduced herself to me, and she said, I've been on to age concern. You can get some grant to help you. She'd done that in 6 weeks. Unbelievable.
So when we think about people in positions of power in this country, often the question arises, how much time have they really spent with some of the people at the kind of margins of society who are living through tough realities like some of the people we saw in that film? And we think that has got to be at the very heart of any sort of social change endeavour, to get alongside people, to understand them as people, not as problems or as statistics in a report, and to glean insight from that about how the system within which they are often placed operates, what kind of incentives it creates, and what opportunities there are to do things differently. So for us, this idea of frontline service really sits at the very heart of Year Here. We think it gives our fellows a chance to empathise with people from all sorts of walks of life, gives them that insight into the system that they're operating within, and probably most importantly, the fire in their belly to go on and actually pursue a venture that will aim to tackle those issues. The fourth idea is that social innovation, social entrepreneurship, making society better, whatever you want to call it, is one of the most difficult things that you can choose to do in society. When you think about kind of commercial entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship has pretty much everything that commercial entrepreneurship has in terms of thinking about a value proposition that works, a business model that's sustainable, a financing strategy, etc. But it also has this extra layer of how do you have an impact strategy that genuinely kicks off like a chain of events that leads to positive outcomes and avoids any sort of unintended negative consequences. And that's a really kind of intellectually taxing task. And yet when you think about how we train up people who are intended to go on to be social entrepreneurs, innovators, policymakers, and compare it to, say, an architect or a doctor or an engineer who have pretty much a decade of professional training before they're let loose in the real world. But when it comes to kind of social stuff, just kind of chuck people in and hope for the best. So we very strongly feel that actually this is a field that needs to be respected and needs to the skill and the aptitude and the mindset and the knowledge that you need to do a really great job in this field should be respected, and we should invest in people's ability to do that. But unfortunately, kind of education often looks like this, whether you're an 8-year-old Victorian-era student or a master's student today. It's the kind of chalk and talk style of education that we're kind of stuck with. And although there are changes in education broadly, this is what education looks like. And so our kind of proposition is that a master's degree in social policy from a top university is not a great preparation, or it's not the best preparation it could be to actually change society for the better. So that leads me on to our fifth idea, that the best way to learn how to build smart solutions to social problems is to try. So these guys who you're going to hear from have done that, have been through that, where we push our fellows over and over again to try and fail in building a project, a venture, a kind of service design fix that's going to try and improve things for people who are living through tough realities. So Year Here is totally experiential. We think that gives the kind of a kind of colour and gravity that you would never get from a lecture hall. Year Here is totally delivered through real-world projects. As a result, we have quite a unique business model. We don't charge a tuition fee to any of the students on the programme. Instead, they work on projects that have a real value to third-party organisations that we charge for, enabling us to not charge them a tuition fee. And also, it's not about a certificate at the end. I mean, we do actually have a certificate at the end, but it's not about that piece of paper. It's about the kind of portfolio of experiences and stories and insights and projects that you've gathered over the year, and what kind of that puts into your toolbox to go forward and build something even more impactful. So the nuts and bolts of the program, broadly, there are 3 phases. The first is a frontline innovation phase, which that video really spoke to. So this is where fellows are placed in community centres, homeless hostels, elderly care homes, pupil referral units for kids who've been expelled from school, to be an extra pair of hands and to be useful, but also to lead an innovation project. Once they've kind of found their feet, had lots of conversations with staff and the beneficiaries of that organisation, they'll come up with an idea to improve and enhance the impact of their placement. Secondly, the fellows work in teams on a consulting project, and that's how we know FCC. So earlier in the year, we worked with John and his team around reimagining the planning process and how we could imbue more social impact measurement in that. And then finally, there's a social venturing phase where we challenge our fellows to draw on the insight that they've gathered through the programme to come up with their own social enterprise idea, and we give them the platform to go off and run that full-time beyond the programme. On top of all that, we have a curriculum, a social innovation curriculum that's delivered through 5 what we call bootcamp weeks, which are very intensive training weeks. There's a speaker series where we get the great and the good from the kind of social entrepreneurship world to come and share their stories off the record with our fellows. Every fellow has a mentor, as well as we've got various partners like Bain, the management consultancy, and Forward 3D, a big digital marketing agency, who teach in the course. There's lots of focus on leadership, so on kind of reflective practice. There's lots of coaching, kind of fireside chats, and a personal development retreat later in the program. And also a big emphasis on being open. Although the kind of community of fellows is really important, it's also important that we're sharing our stories and our lessons with the wider world. So we have lots of events that people from all over come to, and lots of our fellows will kind of blog through their journey. So the deal to the fellows is it's a totally free course, kind of unaccredited but free. We also offer, through what we're creating a foundation this year that will offer bursaries and discounted accommodation. We've been doing that over the last few years to widen access. Because even though it's free, you still have to survive for a year in London without a salary, so obviously that's really tough. Most of our fellows will work part-time on top of the programme, but we offer bursaries to those who would really struggle to take part otherwise. Since we started, we've had over 7,000 people have started an application with us, and we've taken on 114 fellows. In terms of where they go on to afterwards, it's a year after the programme, about a third of them are running a social enterprise, and then 48% are working for other charity or social enterprise startups. And the remainder are in government, innovation agencies, and some are in frontline delivery as well. But on to the kind of meat of today's talk. This is really about how social enterprise and cities, smart cities and cities innovation interrelate. And I mean, obviously, I feel like this room is very familiar with the context, huge demographic changes, rising inequality, most notably in the housing crisis, climate change, and I guess a change in expectations from citizens who are living in an increasingly connected world. And we all want our city governments and local authorities to be more innovative, but often the kind of risk aversion, focus on process rather than outcome, and kind of siloed thinking are still prominent factors in the public sector. And so social enterprise, to me, offers an opportunity to act outside the system, so outside the constraints of the public sector or the demands of the private sector, to be free to design new ways of relating between different people and different organizations, new solutions to work across systems rather than just within silos. And I want to share 4 ways in which I've seen how social enterprise's unique position has been able to start to change the way we do life in cities through 4 social ventures, and then you're going to hear from 3. So these 4 that I'll talk about are all from the Year Here portfolio. The first I've called the gig economy for good. So I think that obviously there's been a lot of talk about companies like Uber and Deliveroo kind of masquerading as cute sharing economy organizations, but ultimately potentially being kind of employers who are dodging their responsibilities to their employees. But I think executed ethically, the kind of gig economy could be a force for good. And we've got quite a few ventures in our portfolio that offer that kind of model. So to start with, this is Birdsong. So Birdsong was founded by 3 of our 2014 fellows who were all placed in, for their frontline innovation phase, they were all in kind of women-focused organizations, working with older women, homeless women, women who had suffered abuse or trauma. And what they found was there were often these little enterprise projects. So there might be a little knitting project or jewelry making project, but they were selling kind of 1 garment a year. And it wasn't really generating much money. It was more of a therapeutic activity. But they saw potential there to kind of bring all those, aggregate all those different projects across London together onto one platform and sell that to kind of a burgeoning 30-something feminist market. So that's what they did. They set about creating Birdsong, which is now a fashion brand. Their strapline is no sweatshops, no Photoshop. So the idea is it's fairer to women on the supply side in terms of how the clothes and jewelry is made, but also fairer in terms of the marketing. So no digital enhancement of any of the models, etc. And yeah, so these guys, what they're doing is creating opportunities for small amounts of income, London living wage, but often, it might be a retired older women who are doing a few hours a week knitting for Birdsong, and that money is going into their group or charity, such that they can pay for more resources, more activities, whatever they want. So it's an idea that's really taken off and got lots of support from a whole bunch of celebrity backers and lots of press. And in the meantime, all these women's groups around London are getting money at a time when they're facing quite severe funding cuts. We've got others in our portfolio. So Chatterbox is a language tuition service staffed by refugees. Juta Shoes are ethical espadrilles made by marginalised women in Bethnal Green. And The Hard Yard is outdoor fitness workouts led by ex-offenders. And all of these are common in terms of offering small amounts of work at London living wage for people who are kind of marginalised by the mainstream labour market. Next up, I want to talk about system fixers. So yeah, often when we think about the institutions that Year Here works with, they at least feel like they're cash strapped. So that their focus has to be quite blinkered on the one thing that they think they do. And what that often creates, there are few incentives for them to think about the big picture. And what that often creates is kind of perverse incentives or cracks through which people can fall. And I think there's a bunch of ventures that are looking at where these perverse incentives exist. Is there a way that social enterprise can jump in and bridge that gap? So an example here is Fat Macy's. So Fat Macy's was set up by Meg and Fred. Meg and Fred were both in homeless hostels. And what they saw was if you work more than 16 hours a week in a homeless hostel, then your benefit goes down, your housing benefit goes down, and suddenly the rent that you pay in a temporary housing unit becomes unaffordable. So essentially, there is no incentive for you to work more than 16 hours a week if you're in a homeless hostel. There's also no mechanism by which you might raise money for a deposit to move into the private rented sector, which is, in theory, what the government is hoping these people will move on to. So what Meg did is basically try to create a way of getting around welfare legislation and to run a series of supper clubs. They're actually crowdfunding now to set up their first physical restaurant. They've been kind of nomadic so far. But the idea is that young people in temporary housing work at these supper clubs. £10 per hour goes into a deposit fund so that as and when they are ready to move out of temporary housing, they have the 750 quid it needs to pay a deposit to go and live in a private rented flat. And so others in this space, again, you find a lot of these problems in the homelessness kind of sector. So another one is Settle, that is looking at a very targeted intervention for young people who are moving into their first home, because there's a huge churn of youth homelessness where people who are not very prepared to live on their own find a flat for the first time, and within a few weeks they'll have messed it up in some shape or form. They won't have paid their bills, they might be in arrears with their landlord, they might have issues with their neighbours, and they're back on the streets. And so Cecil is recognising that, again, this is an example of where it seems like it's no one's responsibility, and yet there's clearly a really negative outcome for the individuals, but also it's extremely costly and inefficient for society as a whole to have this kind of negative cycle. So those are our system fixes. Next up, remixing resources. The idea, like in many ways, we are living through austerity. In other ways, it's a time of abundance. So you could see kind of inequality in the distribution of resources as a distribution problem. And a lot of our social enterprises have been thinking about how can you better spread out the resources and wealth that we have in kind of smart, creative ways. So this example is the Middle Ground, which was a project that started, again, in homelessness context, but branched out to more kind of community-based spaces. So the Middle Ground takes underutilized community spaces and starts renting them out. Starting out in this homeless hostel where they found that there was a space maybe a bit like this that was dramatically underutilized. So they just started renting it out to yoga instructors, Zumba instructors, etc., who got a cheap space to do their sessions in, on the condition that they engaged the residents of the homeless hostel. This idea then expanded out to estates where you often have community centres that might be owned by a local authority or a housing association that might literally have one event a week, so a kind of children's birthday party, and that's it. So it's about breathing life back into these spaces and finding a way to make the business model work so that you're getting enough money from private instructors and teachers and facilitators who want to use the space, but you're also finding a way to embed a social impact in there by enabling local people to access those services for free. Another example of this would be Repair and Care, which is a project that we ran with a housing association in Camden. So Repair and Care was looking at how you have a bunch of repairs contractors in housing estates who will be going in on a regular basis to visit people's homes, who are purely looking at the physical kind of state of the home. They're not so much trained to look at the well-being of the individual. So Repair and Care was looking at how can we train those repairs contractors to spot the early signs of vulnerability and make the kind of relevant referrals. So it's an opportunity there to kind of double your money in terms of you're getting the repairs done, but you're also thinking about how can we ensure that residents are getting the support they need. And then finally, so kind of tech for good, I feel like the golden kids of technology are in our evening standards every day. You see another kind of 23-year-old who set up an app and is getting all sorts of support and press attention and investment, and that's brilliant. And as a result, it's attracting a whole bunch of talent. But ultimately, a question that I certainly have is a lot of these tech innovations feel like they're about making middle-class lives slightly more convenient. And it feels somewhat kind of peripheral to when we think back to the huge problems that we're facing as a society. Wouldn't it be great if we got some of that energy and talent focused on the problems that really matter to society? And we're certainly finding it here that we're getting more and more applications from people who are in the tech industry who are kind of discontented with the lack of soul or purpose in their organizations, which is super exciting for us because that means we can use their talent and their skill towards solving social problems. So a great example of that is Sagar Gupta, who was part of the consulting team that worked with Future Cities Catapult earlier this year. Sadly, he couldn't be here today because he's on Bethnal Green Ventures, which is a Tech for Good accelerator program. He ran a couple of tech ventures, went through some Silicon Valley incubator programs, and then came to us for precisely the reason I was explaining earlier. He was dissatisfied with working for organizations that didn't have a strong enough social purpose. So he came to us. He was placed in a homelessness context and saw how funding cuts meant that the support offered to pretty vulnerable young people was really falling off a cliff, and you would end up with, you have a 1-hour session a month that's supposed to somehow turn around all the issues that you face, be it substance misuse, family breakdown, and the fact that you're homeless. So he developed a chatbot. So it's embedded it within Facebook Messenger. So it's a chatbot that people can engage with at any time to help them understand their welfare rights, so what benefits they're entitled to help them understand their housing options, job opportunities, etc. So these chatbots, which we often see, kind of the main way I've seen them springing up is when you're trying to book a flight. Again, often the kind of innovation is oriented towards where the most money is, but this is about employing an innovation that's really booming in a field that doesn't get much attention. So how about a chatbot that supports people who are in very, very vulnerable situations to get out of that situation? Not to kind of replace the human support that's there, but the cold, hard reality is that these people might only have 1 hour a month of kind of well-meaning adult in their lives who's supporting them to leave temporary housing. We're also going to be hearing from Apps later, which is another one of our Tech for Good ventures. So as long as these existing systems that we were talking about earlier in local government are porous and flexible enough to integrate some of the solutions that I've shared with you today, I think there can be a real sweet spot in how social enterprise works with government to make city life work better. It's my belief that government should be the kind of ultimate arbiter of equality and ensuring that everyone is getting what they need. But I think social enterprise can be an amazing engine for innovation. The way that I often think about it is that social enterprise could be seen as the kind of research and development department of the public sector. So I'm going to hand over now to three of our ventures. We're going to tell you a bit more about theirs. I think it's Jake first. Yes. So over to Jake.
Thanks very much, Jack. Thank you. So I'm Jake. I'm director of Kitchenette Carts. And we'll hear a little bit more about that in a second. But first of all, here's a picture of one of our sandwiches to get your attention. And one of our biggest fans, Xander, or the Zamwich, as he likes to call himself, enjoying one of them. So Kitchenette Carts is a new street food social enterprise for East London, launched by Kitchenette, London's food startup incubator, and funded by the GLA and the Mayor of London's Regeneration Fund. Based in Tower Hamlets, we sell delicious, sustainable sandwiches inspired by the culinary history of the East End from our food truck, and train and support young, unemployed Londoners to gain skills, move into work, and start their own businesses. Food is, and always has been, an engine for social change. Food is universal, it brings us together, but making it inclusive and making sure opportunities are available for everyone takes a lot of work. London's food industry is booming. There are more than 500,000 jobs in London's food sector, more than 30,000 food businesses, and London's food scene turns over £20 billion every single year. Food has always had a central role in regeneration, but the challenge is democratising and diversifying the opportunities that are available so that people from the regenerated communities get to play a part in the regeneration themselves. Roger Madeline, CEO of Argent, the property developer behind King's Cross Central, understands the role that food plays in regeneration. Speaking about developing King's Cross Central, he said, "We are creating new streets and new public spaces at King's Cross. For the first time in over 150 years, the general public will be able to wander onto what was formerly out-of-bounds railway land. Why should anyone want to wander to the north of King's Cross and St Pancras stations, though? Food was a big answer to this question." At Kitchenette Carts, we're trying to connect the dots between London's booming food industry and its disadvantaged young people, to help make sure that regeneration includes the communities that are so often excluded from it, and to give our trainees the chance to shape the food that people eat in London and become tomorrow's street food business owners. We believe that people learn best by doing. Our 12-week training program provides 18 to 24-year-olds with paid work placements with our network of top street food traders and restaurants, shifts in our own street food truck, and training workshops and mentoring by industry professionals. Our mentors, stages, street food placements and visits are some of the best loved and most respected in London. Each placement, including in our own truck, is designed to enable our young people to get a rounded, holistic view of street food and understand all the aspects of the business. We also spend a day in the kitchen with our trainees each week, focused on cooking and learning about provenance and sustainability, and developing the skills needed to start and run your own street food business, including branding and how to write a business plan. Every penny of the income from our street food van goes into our work with young people, creating a sustainable income stream and a practical, working, mobile training kitchen where our team of chefs and street food mentors can train and support our young people into work. It's important that we stay rooted to the communities that we set up to support. Our pink truck travels the length and breadth of London, but the sandwiches that we sell are all inspired by the culinary traditions of East London's diverse communities. From our Vietnamese Nam Pang fried chicken sandwich, to our Jerusalem breakfast bun and our East End fry-up roll. Our kitchen and classroom-based learning days are taught from community kitchens in Poplar, and our programme includes visits to Billingsgate Market and local community bakers. With our next cohort starting in October and finishing in January, we're expecting 24 young people to complete our Level 1 Cooking and Enterprise workshop, 12 young people to complete our Level 2 3-day bootcamp, attaining a Level 2 food hygiene certification, and 4 young people to complete our Level 3 12-week street food incubator, resulting in full-time employment. We're just getting started, and we're always looking to meet people who can help us reach our vision of greater opportunities for disadvantaged young Londoners. We're always looking for volunteers to help work in our truck. We accept donations and help with grants and fundraising. And most importantly, we'd love for you to try one of our sandwiches. Our van is currently off the road, getting some upgrades to increase our trading capacity, but we'll be back at Victoria Park Market and other great street food markets across London soon. Thank you for listening. You can reach me on jake@wearekitchenette.com or have a chat after the talk. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks. Hi everyone, I'm Laura and this, oh sorry, can everyone hear me okay? Great. I'm Laura and this is Charlotte and we're the co-founders of In Common, a new venture supporting independent living in older people. We met last year while we were both fellows on Near Here, and we came together in May to start In Common out of our joint interest and experience working in older people's social care. I've worked before as a carer on a one-to-one basis with a few older clients, and Charlotte has worked in a residential care home. In both these contexts, we saw how the social care sector tends to respond to crises rather than investing in prevention. Around 96% of local authorities' adult social care budget is typically spent on statutory provision, which means discretionary services like lunch clubs, exercise clubs, and day centres are not prioritised and are often the first to lose their funding. A classic example of the lack of investment in preventative initiatives is the problem of social isolation amongst our older population. Loneliness is as bad for your health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, and maintaining stronger social connections is a huge part of living a healthy, independent life in older age. This is not only beneficial for older people themselves, but postponing entry into a residential care home saves typically £26,000 per person on average. During the incubator phase of Year Here, Charlotte and I knew we wanted to focus on supporting independent living for older people, and we looked into different models that could help tackle isolation. This brought us to sheltered accommodation, where residents live in their own flats, but with some support from staff. In theory, this provides a sense of community, but a strong sense of group culture doesn't always just develop by itself, and often residents can feel lonely when they move in and feel cut off from former support networks. Residents that we've spoken to in schemes have spoken about feeling isolated and say that there's not a huge sense of community or stuff going on around them. A contributing factor to this is the fact that a lot of housing associations over the last few years have changed how these schemes are being managed. Previously, there was a live-in warden who was there full-time, and part of their role was to provide support to the residents and to organise activities. But now, schemes are moving towards a structure where they are managed by a coordinator who will be there just part-time and will probably oversee 2 or 3 other schemes, and therefore cannot provide the same support to residents as they were used to.
So developing a social enterprise that tries to tackle this issue in sheltered schemes has been an exciting but a challenging issue, particularly finding a business model that can really make it sustainable. We've been really keen to harness the assets that we've seen being underutilised in schemes, whether it's community spaces that are empty morning till night, or residents with lots of time, the desire to be more involved in their community and energy, but not really a good outlet for that. So the programme that we've developed, and this is the most recent iteration of a rapidly evolving business, is a community building programme that goes into a scheme and provides a rapid turnaround service. We run a 4-day programme over the course of a few weeks, which aims to harness the talents and skills of people living in sheltered accommodation to run sustainable activities there in the longer term. There are 3 elements to the way that we do this. First, we listen. We think it's really important to spend time with the existing people in the scheme, finding out what makes it feel like a home and what they'd like to see there. Secondly, we build capacity. So we work with a training model, supplying what we need, what's lacking in the assets to enable people to run, whether it's bingo or a reminiscence group. Sometimes people need a little bit of extra support to be in a position to run those on an ongoing basis. And finally, we introduce systems. We've seen that one of the real reasons these things don't carry on is the lack of really very basic level systems for them to be organised on a regular basis. So we provide a simple toolkit that can facilitate that happening regularly and as easily as possible for both the residents and the scheme manager. Our business model as a social enterprise is that we're selling to housing associations and providers of sheltered accommodation. Their most pressing problems tend to be around tenant dissatisfaction with the changing level of support and the demand that can put on their staff from the challenges that happen when schemes reach crisis point with their communities disintegrating. So what we offer is an annual service which we are trying to develop the business case for at the moment through a pilot that we're running with Southern, which Laura's going to tell you about.
So as Charlotte mentioned, we've just started our pilot programme with Southern Housing, working in 2 of their schemes with around 95 residents. We're doing this project in 2 phases. Initially, 4 weeks of research, exploring the question, what makes you feel at home? We'll work with residents in groups and on a one-to-one basis to look at the underlying patterns of what would help to make them feel at home and any steps that we could take to be able to get there. We'll follow this 4 weeks of research with 4 weeks of prototyping a bespoke version of our community building programme designed in response to the feedback that we've received from residents during our research. And after this, we'll be looking to fine-tune our product in order to work in more schemes with more housing associations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hector, and I'm the founder of APT. So APT is a SMS platform powered by behavioural economics to help GP surgeries hit incentivised NHS targets and provide quality care to their patients. I want to start off by talking a bit about the problem. So within the NHS, long-term conditions account for 50% of all GP appointments, and they account for 70% of all days spent in hospital beds. And when you take account of the fact that 15 million people in England alone suffer from long-term conditions, but they account for 70% of the entire health and social care budget. This is a really big problem for the NHS and for the people suffering from long-term conditions. Secondly, cancer. Cancer costs the NHS £5 billion a year and the economy £18.3 billion. But the problem here comes in management. So often we know what the management of long-term conditions and chronic disease requires, and it's early diagnosis, measurement and evaluation, and clinical support and advice. So in response to this, the NHS sets targets to GP surgeries. These targets are incentivised. So basically they ask the GPs to get patients who are either at risk or suffering from one of these conditions, of which there are up to 75, to come into the GP surgery for a specific appointment that either diagnoses, manages or measures a long-term condition or chronic disease. And these incentive payments are supposed to be there to encourage the GPs to take part. The problem with the current system is that it is unpopular, ineffective, and inflexible. So it's unpopular with the staff. The staff who are actually running these programs are expected to call and recall the patients who are eligible for these appointments. This often means them sitting on the phone for usually days at a time with again and again and again to the same list of 100 to 200 patients, asking them to come along to an appointment that they don't really understand why they need, and the easiest answer is often no. But also, these receptionists are calling patients when there is only between the hours of 9 and 5 in the daytime, and a lot of people are at work then or unable to answer the phone, and if they don't answer, or even worse, if they don't speak English, they're unable to actually understand why they require this appointment, or they might even miss it entirely. Secondly, it's ineffective. It's ineffective because only 8% of GP surgeries actually achieve these targets. So that means that these incentive payments aren't actually working properly. So the average GP, of which is 7,600 in the UK, misses out on £4,200 of incentive payments every year. Finally, it's inflexible. I mean, how often have you received a letter from your GP that's just a generic letter? It's clearly been sent to everybody who is required for a certain condition or for a certain appointment. The GPs know an awful lot about you. They know your name, they know your demographic group, they know your gender, but they fail to tailor any of this messaging to the individual. We're going to talk a little bit about the health inequality in London as well. So this is where my experience with Year Here kicks in. I was working in a GP surgery in Tower Hamlets called St Paul's Way. And here, this little infographic shows you how life expectancy changes as you travel eastwards along with the Jubilee line. So between Cannon Water and Stratford, you'll stop at Canning Town, which has a life expectancy of about 78, and that's in Tower Hamlets. It's one of the most deprived and diverse communities in London, but it also has some very serious chronic condition problems. Up to 48% of people suffer from diabetes, and this was the patient community that I was working with. So this is where my innovation steps in. So rather than calling and recalling patients, I did a simple SMS system that texts out to patients who are eligible and explains why a particular appointment was suitable for them, and gives them a link for more information, and then invites them to reply back, book. And if they reply, then we offer them a choice of free appointments. They can then reply to that to this text message whenever they want, any time of day, and they'll book themselves into an appointment. But within this, behind the scenes of this platform, we use targeted engagement to actually target people's insecurities about a particular condition. For example, cancer screening, in cervical cancer screening, which is the latest and largest program I've ran. That requires patients to reply when they are mid-cycle, and then to reply to that when they would like to book an appointment. But there are an awful lot of cultural barriers within cervical cancer screening. And what we try to do is try to target individuals with respect to the specific barrier that they face, and try to use behavioural economics to increase the response rate. And we're actually seeing that we can increase the response rate from a generic text message, which the response rate then is about 10%. We managed to increase it up to about 40% through the course of a program. So the stage we're at now is very manual. So it's me actually replying to all these messages. But that's, for me, and we recently booked in 55 people for the cervical cancer screening, and that involved messaging 550 people. And the problem there is that it's just not sustainable. It's no better than the call and recall system. Practices spend around £22,000 a year on staff time, just calling and recalling. My estimation is that this can take away about 60% of that time, and actually allow the practice management and the administration staff and the receptionists to focus on those who have either multiple long-term conditions and need more specialised appointments, or to reach out to those who are harder to reach. But there's two things that really excite me about APT as it could be. And the first one is the targeted engagement. The people that we're seeing respond to this is actually really surprising. One of the practice managers at St Paul's Way, Raheli, she said, I read through the list of who's booked in through APT, and it really surprised me because I knew a lot of the lists on the name. I'd recognise them because I've contacted them so many times. And these are people who don't necessarily speak English, and who she called during the day. They have to wait until their son or daughter was in to translate. Or there were people who were just traditionally really hard to get hold of and just wouldn't answer the phone. But what I was seeing was when I looked at those people who she pointed out, these are people who responded not straight away, but they responded that evening or in some cases up to 3 days later to book an appointment that they were invited to. So there's a lot more flexibility in this system. The second one is data analysis. So the data analysis and what goes on behind the scenes is when this gets really interesting. So we can start to look more about the tailoring of these indicators. I mentioned before there's 75 different conditions that you could have that you're required to go to an appointment for. We can start to get really targeted and really specialized on not only who you are and invite you based on your demographic group and your gender and your age, but you can start to look at how many conditions do you have? How can we make that as easy for you as possible to come to the GP just once and see 3 different clinicians? Maybe you want to see a nurse, a doctor, and a healthcare assistant, and you can have your whole half a year's worth of appointments for many conditions in one point. Why come for 4 blood tests when you can come for 1 and just have 4 samples taken? These are the sort of the future I see of dealing with long-term conditions through something like APT. But yeah, so the next step for me is automation. So we're going to try and build up a platform that is smart and can take into account of these of your individual categories and respond in kind. And we've recently reached out to our second GP. Today, actually, we started with a second GP. And we're hoping to look to increase up to about 10 GPs and spread then to the rest of the hamlets and beyond. But thank you very much for listening.
Thank you to all our speakers there. Some really interesting businesses. So we've got about 10 minutes left. And so for this section, I thought we would maybe invite our speakers back up to take part in a quick panel and then open up to Q&A from yourselves out there. Also questions for Jack, I guess, during that Q&A as well, if you've got any specific questions. So yeah, if you guys want to take your seats.
You can stand. Or Jen.
So I'm just going to kick it off then. I'll kick off a couple. So I was wondering, maybe for In Common first, actually, what's the biggest challenge that you've faced and I guess conquered so far in setting up your venture and your experience so far over the last year or so?
It's over the last few months. We set up In Common in May. Mm-hmm. I think one of the biggest early stage challenges was that we were originally 3 founders. So we were working through the incubator with another person called Alice. And during the final phases of that, she decided this wasn't the right thing for her at the moment. And we had to reevaluate not only kind of how we work and the different roles, but also some soul searching about whether this was the right thing for us to do. So I think in terms of, we've lots of challenges we haven't conquered, but one that we have was deciding to continue and readjust how we split our work from a 3 to a 2. Mm-hmm. Yeah, to add on that?
Yeah, just that that was quite a shift to get used to, because losing a member when there's just 2 of you, we were making a lot more progress, and that was a big change of pace to get our heads around. And as Charlotte said, like reevaluate actually whether we wanted to keep going as well. But as she said, we overcame it, and we're still going with it, which is great.
I was going to ask as well then, maybe to yourself, Hector. We heard from you just there about your experience of working in GP surgeries, etc. So, what, aside from the opportunities that you saw there, like what other sort of things did you sort of glean from your insights of working in this sort of sector for where innovation can come in and make a bit of a difference in that sector?
Actually, the biggest surprise to me from completing the Year Here programme and working in a GP surgery was probably how commercial any innovation had to be. It's almost not enough on a micro level to be for good, or to work or to do well. It has to fit into the incentives of the individual practices, and that's where I think Jack mentioned it in his talk, where social enterprise can step in as this sort of R&D department of the public sector. It's very difficult to get more than one GP surgery to do anything unless it fits their incentives, unless there is a benefit, a cost saving or a revenue benefit to them, especially in the current funding climate. So yeah, the insight that it's not sufficient just to be good. You have to be to fit into their business model as well.
Okay, so I think just final question for me then before we open it out. I was wondering, obviously there's a lot of larger organisations out there. Yeah, here does attempts to try and get people working with them. But for now that you're in your social ventures now, how can people sort of engage with you, reach out to you, and what sort of experience might they have from working with a social venture? Maybe I'll ask that to yourself.
I'll have to grab the mic.
To Jake.
Thank you. So I think there's plenty of opportunities for partnerships with the larger organisations, like you say. Quite interestingly, we're just exploring a sort of corporate volunteer programme at the moment where people from organisations can come and work alongside our young people in our street food van, can participate in sort of learning days, on visits to, say, Billingsgate Market in the morning, which is quite a fun one. And also towards the end of our programme, when we're focusing on our sort of incubator phase, where we're helping our trainees develop their own business ideas, having business mentors come from larger organisations is really helpful for us and is something that we definitely want to explore more of.
Thanks very much. Does anyone out in the audience have any questions for anyone based on anything we heard here today?
I guess largely about the program in general. Since a lot of issues tend to have challenges across multiple levels and kind of don't usually take one solution, have there been opportunities to kind of leverage your own internal network to have multiple groups targeting the same problem or same area?
So, if I understand your question correctly, we've definitely started to see collaborations between different year here ventures who, for example, I talked about Cecil and Fat Macy's. So Fat Macy's being a vehicle through which homeless people can earn the money they need to move out of temporary housing, and Cecil being a practical one-to-one support program. So those guys now work together so that once you kind of go through the Fat Macy's system, as it were, and you've got your deposit, you're then supported by someone from Cecil as you move into your first flat. So we're starting to see some of that. I also think there's interesting opportunities when fellows come from different placement areas and then come together and think about where the opportunities to work together are. So yeah, all sorts of blends of kind of education with the refugee crisis, with ethical business, all sorts of kind of new recipes that add up to something a lot more kind of creative than the existing kind of public sector comes up with often. So it's often the intersections where the most exciting stuff happens, I'd say.
Hi, Matt from Nesta. I work mainly on tech for good, but also on social innovation a bit broadly as well. And I guess what we kind of see is literally kind of thousands of amazing social enterprises and tech for good initiatives, and relatively few of them kind of scaling and leading to system change or getting into kind of public, kind of mainstream, large-scale public provision. So I'd be interested to hear perhaps from Jack, but also the others, about kind of what you think the biggest barriers are, and then maybe from the guys, from the others, perhaps too early, but what you kind of what your kind of ideal situation would be to grow and scale where you might be in like 5 years or so.
I think maybe the kind of emergence of like this tech for good scene maybe came at like quite a bad time, in that it was like maybe after like 10 years of commercial tech really booming, and you know, you'd meet like every, I don't know about you guys, but every kind of social function you go to, you meet someone else who's building an app that's going to do something else. You're like, surely there's too many now, and you're not all going to make viable businesses out of this. And at that very time, that was the moment when suddenly people in the social sector were excited about what technology could do. So I feel like there was a proliferation of ideas that if you were really critical, you couldn't see a business model in there. And that's ultimately the key. Whether you're selling to public sector or selling to people directly, you're going to have a viable business model. And ultimately, I think one of the kind of difficulties with social enterprise is, if we're honest with ourselves, we are unlikely to have IPOs or huge profit margins, which means we can get the level of commercial investment that an Amazon or an Uber would have got to spend years and hundreds of developers building up a product and building up value before you can monetize it. So we're unlikely to replicate that level of investment. Therefore, you have to get much quicker to this business makes sense, it is making money, and we're covering our costs than you do in commercial tech, which is, I guess, back to Hector's point, is you just have to have a rigorous understanding of the market that you operate in, what the incentives are, what the pain points are, what people might be prepared to pay for, and have that from day one, rather than adopt the kind of, we're just going to build something great that people love, and then later we'll think about how it's going to make money. You can't afford to do that, in my view, in social enterprise.
Hi, I've got a really easy one. It's to Hector. Just a shout out. You say you're looking for money. Are you pitching to the KTN, the digital health program that's on at the moment?
I had not heard of that, no. So
it closes on October the 11th.
I'll make a note right now.
You'll fit well.
Anyone got any final questions? Yeah.
Thanks. I came in late, so I may have missed a lot of stuff. But what interests me in what you're each doing is you're illustrating a cost somewhere and illustrating a benefit in your solution. And the cost may be in another silo to your solution. What sort of connected business models are going on, either with yourselves or within government or the private sector? Most business models seem to be very silo-orientated, not systems-orientated.
Yeah, I think that's all social enterprise ultimately comes down to exactly what you referred to there. I often see it as a bit of an equation where you're balancing desirability, you have to be building something that people want, viability, it has to add up to a sustainable business model, and impact, it has to lead to something that's a positive outcome for people. And yeah, very often it's about finding a problem over here and different problem over there, and somehow your solution is gonna tackle that pain point, but also solve that problem. So I'd say almost all our ventures have that kind of model at their heart.
If I could just jump in on that as well. In terms of, I can only speak from health. It's my area. But the idea of like accountable care units coming to the fore, where they've got oversight for quite a lot of these different silos that have existed in the past. I've come up against that already, where you can prove social value in terms of missed appointments in GP surgeries. You can manage to show like an annual benefit of about £30,000 of efficiency savings. It's very viable to spread to a lot of places, but because there's no cash flow change for an individual surgery, no one will put the money in and put the money where their mouth is. So this idea of moving things to a bit higher up the spectrum and someone with an oversight for all these different silos or a number of different silos together, I think is a real opportunity to have someone take a bigger vision, but it requires the people working in those higher up units to have the vision for broader efficiency savings and something that's not necessarily a balance sheet change. Yeah.
And similarly, in social care, I think it's one of the most siloed. So a lot of the cost savings from people engaging within common and being less isolated will be to social services or health. They won't be to housing associations. So that's meant that we've had to really work on developing what the business case is for selling to housing associations around their demands, their pain points. But it also means that we're not capitalising on all of the cost savings that we potentially generate for other services. And that's something we'd like to have a better mechanism to take advantage of.
So thanks very much again to our speakers from today. I hope that this has been quite informative for everyone and an opportunity to engage with this topic a bit more. Thanks very much for you guys coming in and speaking. I'm sure if anyone's got any questions afterwards, they might be able to grab some people outside. But yeah, thanks. Enjoy the rest of your week.